Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Live, Pumpblank's weekly broadcast bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday live from East London. Today we're looking at stem mixing and mastering in Logic Pro. So today is all about stem mixing and mastering, how to mix using only the essential parts of your track summed together. And if you want to learn more about mixing, mastering, and a lot more things like that, make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. And remember, we are completely live, so get your questions for Justin in, and we'll chat to them at the end of the broadcast. So Justin Lyndley, one of our Art of Mixing instructors.
Yep. Indeed.
Welcome to Friday Forum again.
Thank you, yes.
So
Good
very quickly, let's just get straight into it. What are stems, for anyone who doesn't already know?
Well, I think some people are confused about that. I think people use the term for any sort of audio parts of a track, really. I think really the best way of looking at it is it's if you have a track that's actually mixed, and then it's submixes of that.
Okay.
So basically some degree of mixing's been done to it. So like the drums will be all one thing and a lot of mixed processing's already on there. So many less parts than you would have in the actual mix where you have everything separated out, separate kicks, separate all the different bits.
So you might just have drums.
The drums.
Stereo drum track.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Or it would vary very much how mixed together that would be.
Okay.
So, I mean, the reason that I guess this came up was I've had a few things to do that are mixing or mastering from stems recently, rather than it being the usual thing with mastering would be that you have a finished stereo mix and you're just processing that and trying to do what you can with that, or having all the parts of a mix.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a sort of in-between area where, from a sort of mastering perspective, I've got a little bit more control actually. And then from a mixing perspective, it's narrowed down my options, which is also great because I haven't then got I can't really mess around with my kick drum and think, well, what about this and that?
And little tiny changes. And
so in terms of actually getting something finished, potentially having it kind of mixed down to stems is a useful stage along the way. Because very often trying to actually finish stuff off is quite difficult for people, I think.
Yeah. So most of the time, stems would have been used for a mix engineer when they got a project and they were just sent some of the stems to mix. But it can also be useful for you personally to bounce your whole mix down to stems. It's kind of like committing MIDI to audio in a way, where it's like, right, this is it, it's printed, it's done, let's deal with what we've got.
Yeah, you're making some more decisions along the way.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a little bit, the first studio I ever worked at in London was built in the 60s and they'd more or less kept the same gear there.
Right.
So it had 1-inch 8-track as its format. So you're having to sort of commit to things straight away, and the speed that you made records with was great because you just had to kind of go for it all the time. So your drums would always just be either 1 track or stereo 2 tracks. And however many mics you mic'd it up with, you had to just make decisions as you went along and kind of commit to it. This particular track we're having a look today, it's from a guy called Leo Lucchini, who's actually one of my students in one of my classes at the moment. And he'd made this track in Ableton, and he'd got so far with it and was kind of happy enough with it. It already sounds pretty good. We'll have a listen with it kind of flat in a minute. Just literally like all the stems that he gave me at the same level. And then, just seeing where we could take it from that. Obviously, we wanted it to sound a bit better, and I guess didn't know quite where to go next with it. So it's just something I'm been helping with him.
Let's dive in then.
Yeah. So we'll have a little listen. So this is just putting all the stems here, all these faders, as you can see, nicely at minus quite a lot. So I've left myself lots of headroom on the mix. So I'll just play it as it is. It already sounds pretty good.
They be like, fuck is he doing? Leaving every stage he blesses.
So there's basically a drum stem. There's a main music stem. There's one more music stem that comes in. And then the vocals are actually split up a bit, which is good, because that was one of the things he was wanting to, was how to sit the vocals in with it. But they are already quite processed. They've already got sort of panning going on them, and they've got reverbs on and various things that, they're committed to, and that's that. So it's already a pretty good sounding track.
Yeah, sounds really balanced.
Yeah. So as you can see, that's just those faders playing back totally flat, all at the same level. So this would be like he was hearing it in his Ableton session before he bounced it out of there. Trying to leave myself a nice, healthy, I've got a very respectable 10 dB of headroom on my output at the moment, so happy with that.
We'll soon deal with that, yeah.
Yeah, that'll soon go wrong. So in that, it's a kind of like mastering and finishing off the mix, or more access to the mastering. I'm going to have a little look at the mastering chain that I came up with it. All I'm really trying to do with any of this, because it already sounds good, is enhance it a bit and try and make it sound hopefully a little bit better. That's really the aim, rather than kind of totally laying into the mix and changing it drastically. So I'll just have a little look down my mastering chain here. Obviously it looks like there's a few things going on. So we'll start with this. This is a plugin that's, it's a free plugin actually, which is really useful. I've used this on a lot of things recently. It's a great, a great free plugin. It does some of the things that some of the sort of more expensive Brainworks plugins do regarding sort of stereo width, and also having this feature here where you can mono the low frequencies in something.
Yeah, and you can set the crossover.
Yeah, exactly. You can choose which frequency here is getting monoed below. So it comes from an old sort of vinyl mastering idea, really, where in order to cut something reasonably loudly onto vinyl, you needed to center all the bottom end if it wasn't already centered in the mix.
Yeah.
But it seems to work even if you're kind of doing that in the mix anyway. It seems to help and make it a bit more just definitive even on the mix bus. So that's really all I'm using this for. I'm not using it to sort of mess around with the actual stereo width of it beyond that. So that's the first one. Like I said, some of the Brainworks plugins have this feature as well. I think I just changed it. I think I started on 120, but anyway, we'll go with that. 100 hertz or below is usually a pretty good situation there. One of the things with this track as well was that I don't really want to make it sound too kind of nice. It still wants to sound a bit rough, and it wants to keep all its bottom end in there. Just very, very simple, very slight tidying up on the bottom, very low down, only 23 hertz seemed to be where it didn't really mess with it, didn't ruin anything. I was just using this stereo tool just to look at the stereo features of some of the other things that were in the mix and seeing how that was going. So I'll leave it off for now. So maybe you should be listening to this as we go along. It'd be useful, wouldn't it? So they're very subtle, these first two things. They're just to do with tidying up the bass, really, to mono and then have a slight high pass filter on the bottom end. This Waves API compressor is quite a favourite of mine at the moment for putting over the whole mix. And actually, this is more or less a preset in there that I might have tweaked a little bit, but called Modern Mastering Glue. And it's unusual because it's probably, when I look at it, I think, oh, I probably wouldn't set it like that. But then it does a really nice job of doing what it says it would, of gluing the mix together. Yeah. At the moment, before I've kind of processed the other things, it looks like it's not really doing much. I mix into it, it'll start to actually do some compressing. Having said that, the analog character on it, on these API ones, seems to do quite a lot more than just adding noise.
Yeah, it's certainly got a bit of low mid.
Yeah.
Peaking up there.
So it's just to glue it together a little bit. Again, another favourite that's cropped up a bit before in some of the mastering and mixing tutorials. This Lufticus EQ, which is a copy of a Mag EQ. Yeah. Which, the thing that's unusual about it is having this air band at the top, where obviously it seems ridiculous to be boosting at 40k, but it's a very shallow shelving filter, so even though you're boosting what looks very high up, it is lifting up things that you can hear. Apart from just the esoteric weirdness of boosting way out of your frequency range, which anyway seems to work. You can hear it's just adding a little bit more clarity to everything. So they're all just subtle enhancements, really. Same with this, with the Pultec EQ. I mean, one of the things they're kind of famous for anyway is just adding character to something. This is a Waves one, because we have the UAD ones in here anyway. But I'm not even using it to do any EQing at the moment, I'm just going to turn it on. and it's just a slight enhancer over the whole thing. It's modelling something that had a lot of circuitry in it, which had a big, strong effect on the sound. And actually, even if you just change where the filters are in it without actually boosting or cutting anything, it has a different sound, it has different EQ curves just by moving this around. Subtle again, but you know, I'm monitoring a little bit quietly anyway, but you'd certainly notice. Obviously sometimes I would be using this to actually do some EQing, but on this occasion it's just acting as a nice little enhancer, a little bit of betterness, which we like, which is also what I'm trying to do with this, which is another plugin from Waves called NLS, which it stands for non-linear summing. The idea of it, to use it sort of properly, is that you're trying to emulate the idea of kind of having a console where you have, maybe you have everything as an SSL and you have VCA groups and so on, and that you would be making an analog summing mixer. Obviously you can just use it as something that just adds the character of certain consoles to it, and then adding more drive to it exaggerates the effect of that. On this one I've chosen this Mike Hedges, I think it was a EMI console, and it adds a little bit of low and a bit of high to me. It seems to make a little bit of extra bottom and top, but certainly it's definitely a nice enhancer.
Yeah,
you have to
I'm
be
a big fan of that.
You have to be a little bit careful because it will actually distort if you do turn it up a bit too much. You know, certainly on a mixed bus it will, make a bit of crunch across everything, and it varies whether that's in a nice way or not. So just subtle enhancement across all this so far, just trying to bring out a little bit more. And then the slightly less subtle would be to just to turn it up. Essentially, I'm using this Waves L3 limiter. I really like this one on bassy tracks because even though it doesn't look like it, it is actually a multiband limiter. It's sort of hidden 3-band multiband as far as I know. So it doesn't suck in the bass too much when you've got a bassy track, so that's going to be helpful on this one. So I'm sure you'll very much notice the volume difference when I turn that on. I'm adding about just over 7 dB of level, even though it's not going to be attenuating it much. In fact, at the moment it's not doing, it's only taking off another 2 dB, so it's not really slamming it too much at this point. There are different, in here, there are different profiles, effectively presets, I guess. Not in terms of where the settings are, but in terms of what the multiband part of it's doing. So I had a little flick through those, and this one seemed to suit it best. On the end as well, I've got foolishly looking at a loudness meter, which I'm becoming fairly obsessed with, this sort of newer way of looking at loudness, and in theory or where we're supposed to be in terms of a sort of average loudness. Loudness units is a sort of update of the idea of RMS really. It's a better way of measuring an average, but it's measuring it over a whole thing. And it's, for broadcast in the States, it's actually in law at this point, isn't it? You have to have a specific loudness of -24 LU. And it's -23, sort of recommended in Europe at this point, though not that many people are going for it. So I'm sort of looking quite a lot of records and seeing where we are with that. And so far I'm at kind of -11 or something, which is pretty loud.
I guess like -10, -9 would be release record.
Yeah, exactly. That's quite sort of common, but I'm just it'll be interesting to see what effects that has. The whole loudness thing once the average is being brought down for right across the board for all sort of broadcasts of music and everything else, then this thing of making things louder isn't necessarily going to help it, is it? It's going to sound worse than something that hasn't been made super loud. So I'm quite interested in that to see how that's going to affect things. This one, by the way, is the only free one that I know about. This LUFS meter. I've forgotten who makes it, but you'll find it out there if you type in free LUFS meter. What we have in this track is one of the things that the guy was concerned about was having the vocals sitting in well. So if that's my sort of starting point as the mastering, then I'm basically kind of mixing into that with my stems. Again, just with the purpose of trying to enhance things, to be honest. So because there's already some processing on the vocals,
This my show like the Truman, but all you clapping actors don't know.
It's already got reverb on there. It's already been EQ'd
now
to
the
some degree,
temperature
I
is
think.
brewing. You know that every team needs a
So I'm a little bit limited how far I can push it because, you know, if I compress it a lot, I'm going to make the reverb a lot more and so on. So, but he wanted it to sit a little bit better and sound more related in the track. So I'll just have a little look through what I came up with. Again, some of these things are just kind of
the Barkley and a U-wing.
almost always
and my
doing with
fangs
many
do the
things
chewing,
at this
so
point in the
don't
mix.
come across me when I'm falling off
rolling
my
off a bit of the
swings.
unnecessary
True
low.
thing.
You
Sometimes
can
there's no
see and hear
reasoning
what's
when
going
life
on with that.
needs seasoning.
You can pull up the
especially
scale
when
here
my
so you can
specialty
see if
is
it's, you
fuming,
know,
blow
sometimes you
smoke
get
out
things
the
that
nose
just
so
because of
the
the
lie
level you
meets the
can't see what you're
cocoa.
doing with
Bitches
the
must don't know
analyzer. If
Papito
you
is
pull up
a
the scale on the
loco.
left, you can
I'm
see
broke
much
though
more
like an
what's
01
happening, so you
Pentagon
can see why
going
we
harder
want to
than the
tidy up
flying
that a
brick
little
made.
bit. As I might have said last time we did one of these, I think very often people go a little bit far with this and have really, really steep filters and cut off way too much of things. I think it's a good idea to do it to a lot of things, probably everything in your mix, but to be probably less than you think you should.
Yeah, no 48s.
People do these kind of like really steep filters and like go all the way up here with it. Well, it's a hi-hat, it should only exist from whatever up, and it's like, it doesn't always sound better. So you make a lot of things sound quite kind of weird and unnatural by doing very steep filtering on them. Most analog EQs are really like this 12 dB an octave. Some of them are less, 6 dB an octave, because of having a more natural sound, essentially. So this thing of being able to make these steep cliffs to fall off is a little, you know, there's times when that's really useful, but it's certainly not a necessity for filtering out low end from things. So again, I've just gone for
now the temperature is
the pull tech on it. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm not doing anything with it. I'm just turning it on.
And my fangs do the chewing, so don't come across me when I'm falling
Here,
off
it's
my
just
mood
a slight, it's
swings.
changed the EQ curve a little bit and
Sometimes
enhanced
there's
it.
no reasoning when life needs seasoning.
Very often on vocals, these are great for adding the kind of airy top end to things, boosting up at you know, 10 or 12 K. I used to think for years that this must be a shelving EQ, but it isn't. It's a pretty broad bell curve at the top.
Right.
But at the moment, he sounds kind of bright enough for what he's doing. I'm not sure that I've ever managed to mix a lead vocal without putting some sort of 1176 on it somewhere along the way, so I'm going to carry on with that tradition. This one's one of the newer UAD ones, model from this blue stripe one, again in waves. There's a blue stripe one as one of the options in there. It was one of the older ones, and they generally sound a little brighter.
Especially when my specialty is fuming, blow smoke out the nose,
So,
so the lie meets the cocoa. Bitches must
make
don't
it quieter.
know
We usually
Papito
have
is a loco.
the opposite effect, don't we, with
I'm broke though
compressors,
like
but-
an 01 Pentagon, going harder than a flying brick made of Teflon.
So I was trying some other things to add some character. At some point I had this driver thing that seemed a little bit much, but it's quite good. We'll maybe come back to it once it's sat back in the track again. And again, I had a different setting on the NLS. I've got the SSL, Spike Stents SSL.
Yeah.
And again, that's a little bit different. It's not so bright sounding.
Smoking blunts till my breath is gone. My metal's
Pretty
on.
subtle, but
Rookies know this pro hot like Szechuan.
somehow it adds a little bit of clarity and focus to it, which is what I really love about these NLS things. Somehow it just makes things have, yeah, just a little bit more place in the mix and makes them more definite somehow. I don't really know how it's doing it, but it definitely does relate to what happens when you spread something across an analog desk. So he's got some of the things in the track already. I'm also like, well, semi-stuck with, in that he's pan things and so on. This vocal just goes onto another track for another verse, just because there's one little overlap. So of course I'm just going to be lazy and copy and paste that whole setting. I just changed something, didn't I, into that lot. So that's just the lead vocal in the next bit, and then we've got various other backing vocals. I mean, quite often with stems, those would be mixed down more. It'd be common to have a lead vocal with its processing on, and then all the backing vocals maybe mixed together as a stem. In this situation, he's left a few more options in here, and they're doing all sorts of panning and doubling. Really, all I was trying to find to do with this, so we've got a kind of selection of things here that I've more or less treated the same anyway. in terms of very simple EQ again, reducing the low. I think I've changed it on some of them, so there's a little bit of a dip in the low mids as well. Let's just bring all these on. So this is a mixture of sort of samples and doubles and backing vocals and so on. And then I've used the LA2A, which is an optical compressor. So it's going to have a sort of softer effect than the 1176 that I've got on the lead vocals. Yeah. So they're not going to sound as present, but it's just going to even them out a bit and sit them in the mix a little bit better. I don't want them to have the same sort of presence as the lead, so it's definitely sort of going for that. And then there's all sorts of things that I'm already, you know, committed to, because he's done automated panning on some of them, and they're already kind of in their position there. So I'll just... The settings are not exactly the same, but in terms of threshold, it's just really to do with them being different recording levels at the time of being bounced. So let's have a look. So there's some samples and
You're killing me, Smalls.
it's all, so there's a double on the main vocal, and then you can hear they've already got reverb on, so that would be hard to deal with. So along with the lead, and my fangs do the chewing, so don't come across me when I'm falling off my mood swings. True thing. You can hear the lead's just more present, isn't it, for having... Again, I'm not going for the NLS to hype them up anymore. I want them to just sound, or the pull tech, which again would make it sound bigger and more important. So the backing vocals are staying a bit more behind. So, you know, I could change the balance a little bit more, but that's pretty good for now. I'm happy enough for that. So, the rest of the things then. So let's have a little look at the drums.
That's everyone's favourite bit.
Yeah, well, let's just put them in as they are with all those vocals and see what's going on with that.
You're killing me, Smalls.
They be like, fuck is he doing? Leaving every stage.
So they sound pretty good, but you know how to do drums. Stronger is always nicer, isn't it? Finding some way of beefing them up even more.
Yeah, it's funny what the NLS has done to the vocal to make it stand out. Now everything else needs to be brought up to match it.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, the drums that did anyway sound kind of all right. Obviously, you could just turn them up. But, yeah, I had a few other thoughts as we went along. So again, actually, they're already mixed together, and some of the things that are in the drum stem are more stereo, less stereo. So again, I've done the same thing of making sure all the kick is right in the middle, or at least the low frequency aspects of the kick. And it sounded a little bit better, just pushing the width out really slightly, not in a really big deal kind of way. There's some other parts of the track where there's more sounds in there and so on. Again, it's pretty subtle, that, isn't it? This EQ, I've actually done some EQing with it turns out. That's a nice surprise. So I've boosted a little bit. What looks ridiculously low down, really.
20.
Again, 20 shouldn't really be in our picture at all, but of course, because they're very broad, all these, the shelf at the bottom, that it does actually pick up a little bit the low. And pulled out the snare a little bit with some 3K. That would probably be better if it was a bit wider, I think. And then at some point I started to have the thought that the hats were getting a bit loud, but this was also partly to do with the rest of the processing. So I've cut a little bit of a shelf at the top. So slightly unusual, I guess, for drums, but so I'm actually cutting a shelf at like 10K, so making them arguably duller, but it sounded better to me at the time. When again, this thing of being able to add a little bit more punch into things, there's quite a lot of different models around of transient designers, which are to alter mostly the transients on the front of things, the actual attack of something. Seem to use them mostly to add.
Yeah.
I tried this one from Native Instruments, which is basically a copy of the original one. It's the SPL one.
Yeah.
And it was pretty good on quite a lot of it. I mean, I'll just make a, you can hear it's adding a little bit on the front of it. But it seemed to make the hats a bit too much, kind of like it was picking those out too much and making those kind of clobber us a bit much. So I ended up back with the Logic one, which, although obviously it looks a bit sort of fiddly, doesn't it? Like, why do you need that many controls where it's basically like attack and sustain? But it has a threshold in it, so I could get it to not do the hats thing quite so much and still put a little bit of punch on there.
So it would only kick in with its transients influence above a certain volume.
What I was hoping for. That's what I was trying to get. So,
that's the idea anyway.
Yeah, so it seemed to not make the hats too kind of in your face, which was not really helping. And at some point I wanted to take a little bit of the kind of clumpiness out of the kick, but also that made more sense with the rest of the processing in a minute. So there's just, again, just tidying up the bottom end a little bit and taking a little bit of the kind of muddy low mid out. It's only slight, it's just a quite narrow little cut. Then I've made a couple of different buses for that drums, for the drums then. First one, again, I can't really remember the last time that I mixed drums without making a parallel bus of some sort. At least a compressor, sometimes more things. So again, you know, it's a fairly kind of standardish thing, I guess, to, there's many different compressors you could use for this. I always kind of like that lack of subtlety of 1176s, just because if you're going to parallel compress something, then you've got that advantage of being able to overdo the compression and it doesn't completely mess up your drum situation. So I've just got a send going to, in this case, I've got a little parallel chain here, so I've got an API EQ, which at some point I did also brighten up, but then I think I went back and brightened up what was sending to it in the first place, but it still sounds better for being on, in that they have the analog section in this definitely adds some harmonics and harmonic distortion somewhere along the way, like API consoles do. And I've got the NLS, again, just trial and error really of which one sounds best on a certain thing. So I've got a little bus chain there. I mean, if I had a lot of it in here, I mean, it's pretty compressed. Bring it back to the beginning, there's some more drums going on. So I'm only going to be able to set that right once it's in the track, but you can hear it's creating more presence really, isn't it? And yeah, you could argue it's louder, but it's not even an argument, it is louder.
It's louder, yeah.
Another thing that happened though, when I had this in then with the...
Sometimes there's no reasoning when life needs seasoning. I'm human, especially when my specialty
just a bit's enough, it just makes enough to give it a little bit more presence, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Doesn't need to be super loud. I think the drums sound pretty good. There was one of the things that was bothering Leo was just how connected everything sounded in the mix. And because there's already quite a bit of reverb on the vocals, I thought it might be nice to put a little bit of reverb on the snare drum. Obviously I haven't got the snare drum on its own. So I sent to another bus here. So I've just sent from my... Let me just get rid of these guys for a sec. Sent to another bus. And there's many ways that if you've got something already mixed together that you could process it in such a way as to sort of extract things. One of the things would be maybe you could split up the frequency bands of something. You could make 3 copies of it and have a low, mid and high, these kind of things. There's lots of ways you could process stuff like that. All I've done in this case is tried to isolate the snare drum. Just turn it up a bit so you can hear it more. Just using a noise gate because I can use the frequency sidechain filter on the gate to narrow it down so that the snare drum is what it's responding to. So I can just pull the snare out of that loop and just gate it out. Obviously you need to get the threshold and the
release time.
Attack, hold and release, how you want at the envelope of it. But yeah, just using the high and low cut, I've managed to get it to ignore the hats and ignore the kick drum sufficiently that I can then just stick that on a reverb. I've just used a kind of funny old spring. Just seemed to sound more interesting than a nice plate or something like that. And then being able to feed a little bit of that back in somehow seemed to kind of glue it all together. I was also messing around with how, again, with this A1 stereo control, with how wide that was, because the spring reverb is generally going to be mono or mono-ish.
Yeah.
But it did sort of seem to help a little bit, widening it out a little bit. So with my drum situation then, I can just add a bit of reverb back in, which is however much I want, and it seemed to help to glue it together a bit. I'll decide in a minute about the stereo or not, but definitely adds a little bit of depth.
Yeah,
to
absolutely,
that.
and the spring's quite muddy in a nice way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not going to get in the way of anything else. It's just kind of giving it a bit more tail.
He blesses up in ruins. But this my show like the Truman. But all you clapping actors don't know.
Yeah, and then I've got a kind of main. So I'm happy enough with that. At least I've got everything there that I can balance up a little bit. Again, I'm going to keep coming back round and fiddling with the actual balance of all those elements, my parallel and my reverb amount. I've got a main musical sample here, which is may well have been already just a sample mixed together. I didn't ask, but there's piano and bass in, whether you consider that a stem or not. It's the same concept. Again, this seemed to help. Same idea. Sticking the bass in the middle, and in this case, making the rest of it wider. Seemed to really add quite a lot more.
Difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's a little bit debatable phase or not is, but it sounds good. So I'm all right with that for now. Again, just a little bit of EQ, just tidying up the bottom, and I guess this was me trying to just kind of. I'm not trying to get like loads of separation with the kick and the bass on this. It's not like in that sense, but they want to be not completely muddying each other. So that little cut there is a slightly different one, presumably from in the drums. Almost the same ideas, same chain of events.
Well,
just a little enhancer chain. But as you can hear, it's. Between those, it's making it quite a lot more clear, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the track. Even better if we hear it in the track. I'm sure I'll just press that.
The hard, you never thought that hip-hop would take it this far. You're killing me, Small.
Be like, fuck is he doing? Leaving every stage he blesses up in ruins.
It's all kind of coming out a bit more. So I'm just trying to enhance it all and make more of what's already good is really the point of it all.
Now the temperature is brewing.
I'm not in that thing of having to like, what am I actually doing? Am I
you're not too
it's kind of, it's already
too many tracks.
Yeah, it's already committed to a lot of it, and it's actually quite fun just trying to enhance it rather than, I haven't got all those kind of like brain aches about like, how should I do that to that bit? It's just like, well, I've got some limitations, which is, creatively quite good place to be in.
Yeah, and in this case it was someone else's track, but you could easily stem out your own track. And
Oh, exactly, yeah, that's kind of, I suppose what a possible creative suggestion would be of like, that to get past that thing of getting rather stuck on having every possibility in front of you. It's like, well, cut some of them down then and see if that gets you to a better place. I mean, in terms of, very often the reason before that I've done stem mixing myself would be if I was in a analog studio mixing on a console, would be that, you do a lot of things that are good, but maybe the actual final balance isn't exactly right, or somebody's going to come back to you and say, can you turn the vocal up or the whatever down or whatever. So that would be the common reason to run out stems of something, so you can put it back into Pro Tools or Logic or whatever and just make some minor adjustments when basically the mix is done, and you just, like this, just enhancing it a little bit in this in-between mixing and mastering kind of area, if you like. So there was one other little musical sample, there's a little flute thing. Again, I'm not going to, probably not going to go through exactly the same things, because you can see I'm just kind of following a bit of a pattern.
Copy and paste, yeah.
Well, not literally, but my EQ is slightly different. But just again to enhance something. What happened a little bit as well though with the track was that through having kind of compressed the drums, as you can see here, I needed to then put a little bit of automation in that the hi-hats sound too loud when they're on their own. They get sucked back in when all the drums kick in. But so these sections where it's just the hi-hats then needed a little bit of volume automation. So again, you've got this sort of overview. Again, some mastering engineers do some automation at that point, whether it's actual automation or moving something manually or whatever, because some of the things you do dynamically to a track are going to knock it out somewhere. So it's the same with these drums on this. The drum processing made the hats too loud in these 3 sections. And then another quite classic thing that can happen when people do bounce things out is that at the end, it all cuts off a bit quick. So it's basically when it's been bounced, it hasn't been, the locators weren't wide enough apart, which is something to really look out for. And the way around it on this occasion was this little flute sample at the end here. I've just automated it to centre some reverb at the end, so it just hangs on a little bit. I mean, it's so this one here. So that's all that's happening here with this flute sample sending to this plate reverb here. I've just used a Space Designer. Nice plate. It's a good title, isn't it? Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that.
You don't want to use shit plate.
No, the one that I never use that one.
Yeah, that's terrible.
So just the sample at the end. It's just then. It's just to make it spin off a little bit extra in the end. Except it didn't. Why aren't we hearing it?
You haven't sent it to it.
Yeah, it's supposed to be. Oh, because I've turned the automation off. That's what it is. Alrighty. Let's try that again. It's going to work way better if I turn it on.
Right.
I think it works. We're monitoring quite
subtle, but yeah.
It's enough to just get the end of it sorted out.
Yeah.
And then, again, because it's another common thing with bouncing tracks is that people start their track on bar 1 and then all the audio just actually starts at the beginning. So again, just added a little bit on the top and moved it all along a bit to to have a bit of silence at the beginning so it doesn't all just kind of clunk in. Just moved it along a bit. So again, just sounding pretty good.
Yeah.
We're monitoring inappropriately quietly for a hip-hop track.
But it's interesting, it's kind of the sum of its parts, if you excuse the pun in this situation, but I mean, the techniques you've done were subtle individually, but together, together it comes together really nicely.
Exactly, it's quite often the case, I think, with mixing and mastering, particularly now that you can have so many of everything. You know, if you're doing things with hardware, it's like, well, you've only got so many things in the rack. So you'd be much less likely to make these quite long, subtle chains of things.
Yeah.
You know, being able to just have like another pull tech that I'm only using because it sounds good when you turn it on. You know, it's unlikely that you would do that in sort of real life with hardware that you've got, well, I can just put one on there that I'm not really, it just sounds all right, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? Or all the rest of it that you could just have another API on there and another, well, actually I'll run that through a Neve and that through an EMI and that through an SSL.
Yeah.
Unlikely in real life. So so we're in a situation where you can do a lot of these nice subtle processors and that, like you say, on their own, any one of them isn't like sort of a massive difference, but the sum of them all is there kind of.
Yeah. A cool thing to try actually is to just speak to a friend who's a producer and do a mix swap. Get them to stem mix your track. It's just really nice to get away from something you've created and because you can really practice your mix skills and go to town on someone else's work. Yeah. And I think it's really helpful. Or you could come and take a course at Point Blank.
There's an idea.
You can swap with students and stuff. So unfortunately, this is just one aspect of mixing. This is just one aspect of STEM mixing, in fact. So,
I mean,
if you want to learn more, obviously you can come here and learn from you.
There's a good idea.
Exactly. And there's loads of questions to get through here.
Great.
I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them, but I'll try my best. So starting from the very top is Adelaide, I'm not even going to embarrass myself or you by pronouncing your surname. Is it better to work with master on or with it off? I guess it probably means the mastering chain.
Well, what seems to have happened more and more is, I mean, if somebody comes to me to master something, then that's what I'm doing. If somebody comes to me to mix something, for example, they don't really then want to take it off somewhere else to be mastered at this point.
Yeah.
Some mastering engineers have said the same to me as well, that like people want them to sort of do mixing as well. It all gets a bit kind of, everybody's doing
Jack
everything.
of all trades, yeah.
And to be honest, it's more rare for me to do a separate mastering for something. I mean, even if I was mixing a whole album, quite often I do this, whereby my mastering and mixing is happening at the same time. It's a little bit difficult to get that right, so that when you put it all together, it actually works like a sequenced album. It's quite hard to do, but I sometimes still do that. Or I think it's a good idea at this point to kind of. Everyone's going to argue with me about this, but
Yeah.
it's an ongoing argument, isn't
Well,
it?
it's
But
just-
I just want to do everything so it sounds like a finished record. So
Yeah, that's true.
Whatever
You always
call
want to
it,
like
whatever.
feel, especially if you're making dance music, you want to feel like you're in the club playing.
Yeah,
it.
so I can bounce this and it's done.
Yeah.
That's it.
Then move on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. 2D Jazz asks, compress before EQ or EQ before compressor?
They're just different, really, aren't they? I think probably the most logical argument with that would be to take out, like if you're doing an EQ that's cutting something, to do that before you compress something.
Yeah.
So the compressor's not reacting to something that you didn't want to hear anyway.
Yeah.
In terms of adding with an EQ, if you have another EQ, like you can see here, I've got EQs cutting something, and I've got sometimes EQs adding something as well, even though I wasn't doing much EQing with my Pultex. Sometimes the compressor will fight your adding EQ. So if you're adding bass into something,
The compressor will rein that back in,
yeah,
so it kind of defeats the purpose.
it's going to have a different sound and a different feel to it. Sometimes you might need to EQ more if it was before a compressor.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not really right or wrong, to be honest, but it's just good to be sort of aware what you're doing. I'd say certainly do all the cutting before compressing. Then, if you're adding anything, it's going to have a different feel and a different sound. Sometimes you won't be able to do the adding you want to if there's a compressor after it. You have to do the adding after,
it
It'll fight you out of it. So,
Yeah.
hopefully that's enough of an answer.
Yeah, for sure. Simon Lee is asking, is it all right to master in the same session as mixing? That's kind of answered that question already. Or would it be better to bounce out the mix and master in a new project with the audio of the whole song? I mean, yeah, we kind of talked about that, but would you say take it into a stereo master?
Yeah,
first?
I mean, there is a lot of good reasons to do that, to be honest, of actually, particularly if you're trying to master like an EP or an album or something, it's pretty difficult to do if you're actually trying to do it with the mix all in progress at the same time, and you're trying to master it so that bounce then sits in sequence nicely.
Yeah.
I sometimes do it, but it's also
And there's
partly
CPU
for-
reasons as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the mastering plugins are going to be heavier on CPU as well.
Yeah.
It's probably much more sensible to do your mix and bounce it out with some headroom, with somewhere 6 to 3 dB of headroom in it, and then have another look at the mastering. Would probably work better most of the time for most people, I'd say.
For sure. 15 Signs asking, when rendering or bouncing for stem group mixing, should you bounce everything to minus 10 dB, then balance the levels accordingly afterwards, or leave the levels as they are?
Well, obviously you don't want things to be clipping. I mean, whenever you bounce something out of whatever, Ableton or Logic or whatever, it's pretty easy to forget that actually it's re-recording it through your mixer, isn't it? So, it's pretty easy to get the levels a bit, either way, wrong. I would say aim for them staying more or less as they are. So you're not, by bouncing something out, you're not either making it super loud or super quiet. Either way, you certainly don't want to make it clip. I think you can see with this one that I've had my sort of headroom mix, just putting all the faders in a row, was at like minus 14 something. So I've had to pull it all down so that the sum of those things was like minus 10 on my mix bus, so I had somewhere to go.
Yeah.
So, this is fine, but obviously I'm having to turn it down a bit to get it to not go over straight away. So, I think, specific numbers, but leaving some headroom, minus 10 is not a bad idea.
Okay.
There, but.
Cool. So, final question. Nashi B is asking, what's the best setting for mastering compressor glue in terms of threshold, attack, and release?
Well, as I said earlier on, this is a preset out of this Waves one, and quite often it isn't what I would think to do. Like,
how come you would think that was maybe not suitable for mastering?
Well, quite often. So, say if I was using like the SSL bus compressor or something, I nearly always default to being at 4:1 and having a long attack, so that all my punch still gets through, because I know it's going to hit a limiter after it. So my transients are going to be in trouble in a moment anyway. They're going to get squashed. So I'm still trying to maintain them at that point, and then I'm usually with the release on that, having it either pretty fast or auto if the way it kind of tracks through the song works better. So I don't usually go for this fast attack thing and a really low ratio, but on this it sounds great. I mean, the threshold just completely depends on how loud the thing is that's coming into it, doesn't it? I mean, there isn't a good threshold preset necessarily, is there? You'd always have to adjust that to find how much compression you're getting. I mean, with this, at this point, what's it actually doing in the track? Probably got like, once everyone's in, it's taking off like less than a decibel, but sounds better with it on. Really slight.
Would you use a makeup? Would you stick to makeup gain in the actual compressor plugin, or be more inclined to wait until the limiter to bring the gain up?
Well, I mean, it's turned up a little bit on the output of this, isn't it? It's adding a couple of decibels. Yeah, I'm more using the limiter to do that. I mean, stages along the way, it depends really. It could be that you don't really need to turn it up at this point.
Actually,
I mean, to be honest, as a makeup gain, that doesn't really make sense, does it? I'm taking off half a dB and adding 2.5 dB on the output. That's just making it louder. But
it's the sound as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the way it's sort of generating some harmonics. It just sounds good. So.
Would you? I was just going to question from me. Would it be better to leave the volume hitting -10 all the way through the mastering chain until the limiter, or would you add maybe 1.52 across 5 or 6 plugins?
Well, all of these, once we get from here to this API, and then I'm boosting a little bit, okay, high up with a lufty curse, and then that one's turning it up, and that one's turning it up. So it is getting turned up quite a bit before it gets to the limiter on this occasion, which is fine.
Do you think gain staging it at each stage, bringing it up slightly, is better than keeping it at 0 and then whacking it by 15 on the limiter?
I'd be more bothered if what was coming into my master bus was really loud. If I was having to do something there to turn it down to start with, I would be less happy about it. So I started off with like 10 dB of headroom, and I've just edged it up a bit, haven't I? And then added another 7 at the end with the L3. So in this case, it was quite well behaved, and you know, something along those lines is quite good shape to be in. And you know, it's never clipping before it gets to the limiter, is it? So it's always got a bit of headroom. So it varies a little bit as well with some of these modelled analog plugins, what they're actually lined up to in terms of level. Like some of the UAD ones, what it's seeing as a 0 is like analog 0, which is pretty different from digital 0. Yeah. So it's pretty easy to be hitting them way too hard. Yeah. And sometimes, you know, stressing them out in a way you probably didn't mean to, because you're probably, you know, way more decibels in than you think you are. Yeah.
So just keep your eye on the VU meters.
Yeah. I mean, some of the sort of lineup of them, it's not like everyone's doing the same thing when they're writing plugins at this point. I think the UAD ones, a lot of them are like analog lineup. So if I was playing something 0 out of this into analog gear, it's hitting it really hard, isn't it? So,
that's something to keep in mind. But you know, we could talk about this all day, but unfortunately,
yes,
we are out of time. Hopefully, you got plenty of inspiration for your mixing over the weekend. But if you're thirsty for much more, make sure you check out our courses on pointblanklondon.com. And we'll be back next week for another FFL. So we'll see you then. Cheers.